9:35 the time on the Suncoast Morning Magazine. And speaking of funny, seriously funny, The Rebel Comedians of the 1950s and 1960s is a fascinating book about the groundbreaking comedians that revolutionized the art form of stand-up comedy and subsequently the way we see comedy on television today. Mort Sahl, Jonathan Winters, Lenny Bruce, and Bob Newhart are just a few of the legendary comedians portrayed in the book. We welcome author Gerald Nachman to the Suncoast Morning Magazine. Thank you for joining us. How are you today?
I'm just fine. How are you?
Appreciate you getting up a little bit early. I know you're out on the West Coast, and I've been reading the book over the last few days, and it's really a fascinating insight into the lives and minds of some of the great comedians. What inspired you to write the book?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, it's an era that I lived through. I was in college when all this started, and I used to go to this legendary club in San Francisco where I grew up called the Hungry Eye. And I used to see people like Jonathan Winters and Bob Newhart, Mort Sahl and Shelley Berman and Bill Cosby and Woody Allen. And so that was one reason I really remember it very well and experienced it firsthand. But the other thing is that this era had never been put into a book before. All these guys, I realized, came along at the same time in about a 10 or 12 year period, which was really a golden age.
It really was. When you look back at what comedy was like in the 30s and 40s, basically from the vaudeville days, it was a lot of stock jokes and kind of non-sequiturs.
One-liners about mother-in-law jokes and all that kind of stuff. And it really wasn't very cutting edge or very socially relevant. It wasn't satirical. It was just, it was really, a lot of those guys were pretty funny, but they weren't really saying anything. They weren't saying anything about the country or what was going on in the world or in their own lives.
Yeah, as great as Jack Benny and Milton Berle was, like you said, it was pretty much material that they've done for years, whereas these new comedians they came out, especially Mort Sahl, a great chapter on him in the book.
Yeah.
He basically just came out with a newspaper and it almost looked like he was making it up off the top of his head, his act.
Well, that was the thing. A lot of these guys wrote their own material. The other guys of the earlier tradition, kind of the Catskill resort tradition, relied on writers. They didn't have original ideas, and these guys all did, beginning, as you say, with Mort Sahl. In just a little over 50 years ago, in 53, this all began with him.
Yeah, I happened to have a chance to see him, I guess about in the early 80s, maybe mid-80s. He was doing a one-man show on Broadway. He came back.
Yeah.
And that was the first time I actually got to see him, in a live performance. I'd seen him on television. And it really was a remarkable how he did it. I know some of it had to be, prepared material, but he'd come out with the newspaper in the sweater and just kind of talking off the top of his head, did maybe 20, 25 minutes on that day's news. Right.
Well, that's it. It seemed extemporaneous, and I think it was all, I don't think he wrote things down, but he created on his, and then he kind of built on that from show to show. But he just had such an inventive, original mind, and there was a different kind of a style that you just put your finger on. It was more of a conversational style. It wasn't the rat-a-tat-tat one-liner style of like Milton Berle, as you say, or Jack Carter, that whole, or the late Alan King. It was really a different kind of comedy in the content and also in the style.
You mentioned the Hungry Eye, and that being really one of the prime comedy spots. I guess you could call it an early version of what became like the Improv in New York and places like that, but Friedman's places.
Yeah, the little intimate comedy club was a new phenomenon, and that helped launch all these guys' careers, because they weren't guys who stood up in a big posh resort somewhere and sang and danced and did imitation. They were really, they were just talking to you, and it was really, and you had to be up close to really catch it all. And it was a different kind of an atmosphere to hear comedy in.
So many people got their start out there. You talk a lot about in the book about that. Woody Allen, for one. A lot of people may not realize he was a fine stand-up comedian. He started out as a writer on the old Caesar show, but he broke out into doing some stand-up comedy. Just give an idea of some of the young talent that started out at the Hungry Eye.
Well, let's see. Well, Woody Allen, he actually started in New York, but he got a big boost. So the Hungry Eye was kind of the flagship club at the time. So you had to really appear here to make it. Well, I guess you could. Well, Mort Sahl certainly, and Nichols and May, the great comedy team of that era, and Mike Nichols and Elaine May.
Right.
A lot of people in their 30s today don't even realize that people like like Cosby and Woody Allen had major stand-up careers. They only know them from television or from movies.
You talk about Nichols and May. They put out some really great albums back then. I happen to have one that was reissued on a CD. And again, when you talk about seemingly coming off the top of their head, they get together and do these great sketches. Especially one about the phone operator and somebody losing their dime. It was classic stuff.
Yeah. They did some classic stuff, and it's really too bad they broke up after about 4 years. But they did some wonderful classic albums that are still available in CD form. I think they only did about 3 or 4 albums. But that was another thing at the time. The comedy album was a whole new phenomenon, and people could make it literally overnight. Shelley Berman was one. He put out the first major comedy album in 1960, I think.
Right. I believe it won a Grammy.
Followed, Inside Shelley Berman, and everybody played those comedy albums. They played them for their friends. They had parties, and that really spread the word quickly. And then they were played on the air, on radio. In those days, a lot of the DJs would play comedy albums, and that spread the word very quickly. Newhart was an overnight sensation, also.
The Button-Down Mind of Bob Newhart really broke him into the consciousness of the public, doing telephone bits.
He's never even played in a nightclub. He made these tapes in Chicago, and a DJ named Dan Sorkin put him on the air, and then he introduced them to some Warner Brothers Records executives, and they listened to the tapes, and they said, "This is great. We really want to. We'd like to make an album. Well, where are you playing?" And he said, "Well, he'd never been in a nightclub. He'd been in one. He'd never played in a nightclub. So they had to find him a nightclub, and then they cut the album over a weekend at a club they found in Houston. But all he'd ever done was make these tapes, and so he had to learn how to be a stand-up comedian."
He was an accountant, I believe, at the time, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was an accountant, which he talked about in his act. That he was an advertising guy for a while, and a lot of his early comedy came out of that. He was making fun of the PR mentality, image makers, and all that stuff. You remember his famous routine about Abe Lincoln?
Abe Lincoln, sure.
Yeah.
Sir Walter Raleigh.
What's that?
Sir Walter Raleigh introducing tobacco as a classic.
Abner Doubleday trying to sell a game idea to Parker Brothers.
Right.
And he did it by this very unusual way of using a invisible person on the other end of a phone, and you had to figure out what the other guy was saying, which was part of the interaction between the listener and Newhart. As you could tell by what he was saying, what the other person had said.
He did it so brilliantly.
Kind of a comedy.
Yeah, he did a very brilliantly constructed act where he'd leave just enough of it out so you had to imagine what the other person was saying.
Yeah, right, exactly. And of course, before here, actually, Shelley Berman was the first. He broke in doing that. And then the Newhart took it in another direction, also using a telephone.
Yeah, Shelley Berman, a little more like manic style, I would say, kind of a nervous wreck on stage.
Well, he was a nervous wreck on stage, and he did a lot of more poignant vignettes. It wasn't strictly comedy. He did a lot of funny stuff, but he did these little vignettes about kind of losers and so on, and kind of neurotic types. He was the first really neurotic on stage neurotic comedian.
You talk a little bit about the book. You got some great stories. The book is called Seriously Funny, The Rebel Comedians of the 50s and 60s. Gerald Nachman is our guest. You mentioned a little bit about Shelley Berman. He was kind of hurt, in effect, by a documentary, wasn't he, where he was doing his act? Talk about that for a second.
Well, in 1963, he was like the hottest comedian in the country. He was sort of the Chris Rock of his day, I guess. And a documentary, some guys who were making a documentary wanted to do one of him. And so they followed him around through a couple of days, and one of the things they photographed was him on stage during a performance. The phone rang backstage, which the audience could hear, and it really just totally broke the mood and ruined his act. And then it rang again, and he just blew up. And during intermission, he went backstage and blew his top. But the documentary filmmakers caught all this on camera. And then it was shown on network TV, and it really destroyed his career. It's amazing that could have done it. But in those days, something that showing a performer being that candid and showing his anger was enough to really hurt his career. The club owners didn't want to book him. They were afraid he was a hothead, and they didn't want to take a chance. It really hurt him for many, many years.
Yeah, basically, he did some acting off and on in television, but never really regained that popularity, did he? Well,
he never did, and the same happened to Seth. Well, that's the other part of this book, is I tell about the rise of all these comedians, but in some cases there were some falls also, some very hurtful.
We're going to pick up on some more of those stories. If you can just hang through the break, Gerald, we'll be back.
Great.
This is the Suncoast Morning Magazine. We're talking with Gerald Nachman. Seriously Funny, the rebel comedians of the 50s and 60s. Stay with us.
Waking up.
I am having a real good time.
AM 1220.
9:49 the time on the Suncoast Morning Magazine. We're talking with Gerald Nachman, a really interesting book, and we really recommend it here. We don't book authors that we don't think write great books, and this is one of them right here. Seriously Funny, the rebel comedians of the 50s and 60s. We're talking about some of the great comics that broke through in that era, and talk a little bit about how the Ed Sullivan Show and some of the variety programs started to book these guys on television back then, and it really helped their careers to last a lot longer, don't you think?
Yeah, that's right. Well, first of all, there was the comedy record that I mentioned, and the other thing that was very important, was the late night shows. Steve Allen and Jack Barr,
right,
when they were running the Tonight Show. A lot of these guys were a little too non-traditional, too cutting edge to get on immediately, to get on the Ed Sullivan Show and the Gary Moore Show and some of the variety shows. They had to break in on the fringes, which was then like late night. So Steve Allen was had a huge part in this. He was, of course, he's in the book. I have a chapter, because he himself was an amazingly funny guy, and he was a huge booster of comedians, and he would bring on people he'd heard about or seen, and Jackie Mason was one, but there were several. And so these guys got a hearing on his show, and then after they had sort of proven themselves on the show, on their shows, on Steve Allen's show, or on Jack Barr, also had a lot of these people on, the Smothers Brothers and Jonathan Winters, and then they would get booked on the bigger shows like Ed Sullivan.
Right. Yeah, you talk about Steve Allen. He actually, I believe, may have been one of the first, if not the first, to book Lenny Bruce on network television, wasn't he?
Well, when I did the research on this book, I found out Lenny Bruce had only been on national TV 6 times in his whole career. And
Is that all?
He built a huge career. Well, nobody would take a chance on him because they were afraid of what he might say, and he had a lot of material that wasn't dirty. Everyone thinks of him as this great dirty comic, but he had some pretty blue stuff. But he could do a non dirty act, but Allen took a chance, and of course in late night, even in those days, you could get away with a little more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a couple of years ago, I grew up in New York and go up occasionally. The Museum of TV and Radio. Have you been there? And you get to see some of the old Tonight shows and shows like that. And you see some of those great comedians there.
That's a major source of just go in and watch any old late night show, and so that's where they broke in, and then people like Ed Sullivan would book them.
Just want to throw out a few names as we have just a couple of minutes left. Talk a little bit about Jonathan Winters. Really improvisational, and his style kind of broke the mold as far as that goes.
Yeah, well, he was one of the most unusual because he was more of a clown. These other guys were more intellectual and satirical, and he was satirical, but he would do all the characters, and he was really an actor. Because when you think about Jonathan Winters, you don't think about anything he particularly said.
Mm-hmm.
It was really about the characters that he created, and the whole. He was really doing these riffs on American archetypes, and he was really one of a kind, and he truly was improvisational. He didn't write anything down. As a result, he really couldn't make a name for himself in movies or TV because directors were afraid to take a chance because, when you do improv, 50% of it is brilliant, 50% of it is terrible.
Right.
And the time is money, and so he never carved out a bigger name for himself.
You have an interesting chapter in the book about 3 Impressionists, which I thought was interesting. David Fry, Vaughn Meader, and Will Jordan, all who really rose to the top quickly and kind of petered out just as fast. Talk a little bit about that.
They all had different sad stories. Of course, Vaughn Meader did the famous First Family album, and he was just another hack comedian until he realized he could do a great imitation of John Kennedy. And then after Kennedy was shot, that was also the end of Von Meter's career. He never came back because he didn't have anything else really that was strong enough, as strong as that. And then Will Jordan, he did the famous Ed Sullivan impression, but he did a lot of great impressions. He was like the master impressionist. And he just, things just didn't break well for him. A lot of people stole his Sullivan act, and so then he couldn't get booked because other people were doing it, and it really pulled the rug out from him. And then David Fry did the great political impressions. He did LBJ, and he did Bobby Kennedy, and that was a whole new thing for impressionists to do political figures. They usually would do, Jimmy Cagney and Edward G. Robinson and so on, Cary Grant. But Fry just had some bad luck. He was apparently was a drinker and just had some psychological problems, I was told, and so that was sort of the end of him.
Hey, you're talking about Will Jordan, just doing some reading on him in your book, and he really was the guy who invented the Ed Sullivan imitation that so many other people stole. And it really has bothered him the rest of his career that people kept stealing from him.
Well, it did. He got a little obsessive with him. He's kind of an obsessive guy, and it kind of ate away at him. But he did a lot of great voices.
He does, yeah.
But the Sullivan one was his calling card, and then when people like Jack Carter and others did it, it hurt his career.
David Fry, they show some of the old Sullivan shows down here on the local PBS station. He happened to be on last week, and he was one of those impressionists like a Frank Gorshin who would almost make his face look like the person he was imitating.
Yeah, well, there were a lot of great impressions at that time. John Viner was another one.
Right.
And Frank Gorshin, as you say, and they became physical mimics as well as verbal.
Just we got about a minute left, Gerald. Anything that really surprised you when you did this research on these comedians? Maybe something you didn't realize about them?
Well, a lot of it was kind of the dark side of some of their careers. Some of these careers that collapsed, caved in on them. There were about 10 or 12 of the comedians who really lost their traction, like Mort Saul and like Shelley Berman. I was aware they weren't around as much, but I wanted to tell what happened to them and the reason why. And it's kind of sad in a way what happened, because they're still just as funny as they were then. They're in their 70s or in some cases early 80s, but it's too bad they're not seen anymore, because they're still just as sharp and funny as they ever were.
Yeah, a handful of them you see performing around. I guess Mort Saul occasionally they'll do something in a club.
Yeah, but
not too often.
Seen much more. He had to be on TV. But if you're not on TV, one of the comics told me, if you're not on TV, you don't exist.
That's true, unfortunately. Yeah. Smothers Brothers, I guess you could say, probably still almost as popular as they were from their television show.
They've had a rejuvenation of their act, and they went through a long period after the CBS show was canceled, where they couldn't get any work, and they really they broke up for a while, and then in the last 10, 15 years, they've had a revival of their career, and they're kind of icons now, and they're still doing the same act they did before.
Right.
And I wanted them in the book because they were rebels, not in their act so much, but in the TV show that they ran.
Yeah, they did a fascinating documentary about them called Smothered, where it went
saw that. It was very, very
very well done. Yeah.
Right.
I guess Bill Cosby. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
They all have interesting lives. They all could have been a book unto themselves, I think.
It really is. You really delve into it and give some good insight, and a fascinating book called Seriously Funny, The Rebel Comedians of the 50s and 60s. And Gerald Nachman, it's been a pleasure to talk to you, and we'll like to have you on again sometime.
Well, Doug, thank you very much. I appreciate talking to you.